neuroscience, quantum physics, biology, plant medicine, non-dual tantric meditative practices. We will be exploring these concepts with experts to provide insight. Get ready to melt reality with us.
For the last 25 years, Adam Jacobs has been striving to grasp and understand the concept of, quote, ultimate reality. He's been exploring the vast, benevolent, eternal, peaceful landscape, those are his words, in his reading, viewing, and interviews with some of the most prominent intellectual minds in religion, science, and philosophy. Adam was born and raised in New York and lived in Boston and Jerusalem, where he received his rabbinic ordination. Adam is also a musician with degrees in music from Brandeis University and in jazz performance from the New England Conservatory. Adam's writing has appeared in the Huffington Post, the Times of Israel, the Algemeiner Journal, and the website of Aish. Adam has a podcast on music and spirituality called The Secret Chord, and he's the host of a YouTube show on science and theology called Feed Your Head. Adam currently resides in New Jersey with his wife, Penina, and 5 children. Adam, welcome.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
All right, so let's start out with going over your resume a little bit, your skill set and your training. So you trained as a jazz musician and a philosopher, and you've been doing a podcast for a number of years now, and you're an ordained rabbi. So just give us a short tour through these various phases of your life and, you know, how you got to this point, and you can sort of emphasize any aspect that you think is relevant. We're going to drill down on specific topics, you know, in the interview, but I thought we could just start with your background.
Yeah, so from about 3rd grade through grad school, I was very obsessed with piano, and that's really what I had expected to do with my life. I think my my main objective was to get a bartending position in somewhere in the East Village and to be able to play, you know, largely inaccessible music to the handful of people who could appreciate it. And that would have been good enough for me. But my life took a sudden detour, which is a whole long story in itself. But I ended up becoming very interested in Judaism and ended up moving to Israel for 5 years. And to the dismay and shock of much of my family. But I tried to explain then, and sometimes still try to explain to people, that I view the two things as related. I think that the musical endeavor at its core is an attempt to do something transcendental. I actually think that music doesn't make any sense physically. There is no benefit to the ear to hearing music, and therefore theology is an addendum to it. Let's say it's another way of doing a similar kind of thing. And so, although I miss it to some extent, I feel like I'm scratching that itch anyway in a different way.
Yeah, that's great. It's an unusual background, an eclectic background, but I think a very poignant background. So you and I have talked a lot about the intersection of religion and science. In fact, I originally met you when I was trying to understand a little more about Judaism and how I could potentially harmonize Judaism and thoughts about Judaism with my scientific background. And I know this is something you've thought a great deal about. So are they compatible? So let's start with science and religion in general. Would you say they're compatible activities?
Yes.
And
Want me to
why?
take it further?
Yes, and why?
To me, they're really two sides of one coin. I think we spoke about this at one point also, but you know, originally science was specifically religious endeavor. The scientific method was created by religious people for religious purposes. They believed that the universe was intelligible. It didn't have to be. And as such, the exploration of the physical world was the exploration of God's mind as manifest in physical reality. It's only relatively recently in the scientific procession that it became atheist, that it became the materialist dogma, as I might view it, became dominant. We could trace how that happened, why it happened, but certainly isn't the way it started. And so I think that scientists, and even the ones who really are steeped in materialism, even the Brian Greens of the world, who are brilliant people, the way they talk about the physical world is with such reverence. It almost sounds to me as if they're having a kind of transcendental experience. It's not like when Richard Dawkins calls the physical world a blind, pitiless indifference, I don't really believe him, because he doesn't talk about it like it's that to him. He talks about it as if it's this wondrous, marvelous thing. And if it really was blind, pitiless indifference, I wouldn't be so happy about it. I think that's an unpleasant way to be, and an unpleasant thing to interact with. So the scientists that I've spoken to, really honestly, from either side of the spectrum, to me sound rather reverential about the way the universe is. And on occasion, there's somebody who is really honest about it. Jacques Monod, for instance, a biologist, Nobel Prize winning biologist, he wrote some disturbing sounding things like, I'll paraphrase it, but basically he says that the material reality obviates the need for or the existence of any type of morality. And he's sort of honest about that. And Freud was kind of honest about, the fact that it made him sick when he contemplated the universe, because he understood that there was no meaning to it, and that was sickening to him. So, which I think parenthetically is the appropriate response to an atheist universe. I think it should be upsetting, and therefore I don't understand some of the revelry with which some atheists conduct their lives, sort of steeped happily in the atheism. In fact, Carlo Rovelli calls himself a happy atheist in his bio. And I asked him, try to understand why, what is happy about it? And so that confuses me. But at the end of your question is, I personally think that science and theology are really hand in glove.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the word I would use, and I might even put myself in this camp at one point in my life, no more, is not so much happiness, but pride. I think there's a pridefulness that scientists have
Okay.
about separating religion from science. And again, I can relate to that. And I agree with you that if you really think about it, it's a little disturbing. But let's segue a little bit into now science and Judaism specifically. So talk to me a little bit about Judaism as a specific theology and what that has to say, and its compatibility or incompatibility with science.
I think the Jewish tradition is very open to taking the research of those who are most skilled at it in the material world, and being open to reinterpreting and or re-understanding what verses can mean in the light of what is discovered. So, there are a bunch of examples that we could point to, but when evolution came along in 1859, there was no opposition to that in Judaism. It was, they looked at the opening verses of Genesis and they're like, you know what, there's a progression from simple to complex here that does seem like it's describing something that we're familiar with. There is no dogmatic opposition to it. I think it was only when some of science started using evolution as sort of a bludgeon against religion, that there was like a defensiveness sort of set in, and there's like an opposition between the two things started occurring. But my understanding, maybe I have to qualify that there are certain fundamentalist elements within any religion, and there are certain fundamentalist interpretations within Judaism, which I think are actually incompatible with Judaism. And especially if you look at Kabbalistic understanding of reality, the reproliferation of the concept of panpsychism, for instance, is very compatible with Jewish thought, and so is a lot of modern physics. So whatever modern physics ends up being about, there are fascinating corollaries between the two doctrines. Again, with the caveat that I don't know whether or not that it's an ultimately true correspondence. They do appear to be there, and if we discover that it's wrong, then we'll have to drop that, but I think Maimonides said it best when he said there is no discrepancy between Torah and science, and if you should find one, it's either your science is wrong or your Torah is wrong.
So good. So good. Well, so, that being said, of course, right now, there's enormous intersection, as you said, between physics, quantum physics, and science and consciousness itself, or spirituality itself. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your views then on consciousness. What do you think consciousness is? Where does it come from? Is it a purely biological activity in the brain, or is it something else that you could put your finger on?
So I'm in the camp that says that that consciousness is fundamental, and that material reality is an outgrowth of consciousness as opposed to the other way around. According to Judaism, certainly from the Kabbalistic interpretation, there is only mind, which is, there's one universal mind, which is at one point in reality was all that existed. We could make an argument, even though it's paradoxical, that that's still all that exists, but that would lead us into difficult waters, but it is a fascinating conversation. But so consciousness, and if you're specifically interested in this, I think that the person who is doing the best job at explaining this at the moment is Bernardo Kastrup, especially in a book called Materialism is Baloney, which I highly recommend, very accessible for a complicated book. He explains, using a metaphor, that consciousness is like a river, and all there is water in the river, right? But periodically, because of the way that the water is moving, little eddies develop, here and there, and they look like little whirlpools, and you could almost come to think that that's a separate reality from the river. But the truth is, of course, that the eddy is no different than the river itself. It's just seems as a temporary, sort of locality that's identifiable. So too, human consciousness is indistinct from the river of ultimate consciousness, and therefore we always share in the one ultimate consciousness, but you could say miraculously, that consciousness has created the ability for consciousnesses to believe that they are separate from it, which is not actually the case, but nonetheless seems the case. Now we could ask a deep theological or philosophical question of why that is, and that's maybe a separate question, but that's my take on it. So I actually asked Bernardo Kastrup when I interviewed him, is what you mean by this ultimate universal consciousness the same as what people mean when they say God? And he said that there's probably 7 billion ways of answering that. He said, but for him, the answer is yes. And he said, furthermore, that he thinks that's always what people have meant by that term. So God is a very loaded and very misunderstood term. And there are theologies, there are spiritualities that maybe have compromised the word or reduced the word in such a way that it is laughable, I think, to some people. But understood more from this kind of perspective, I think it becomes very approachable. And that's how I approach it. So that's what I think.
So let's follow up with a little bit of jargon for the benefit of our listeners. So tell us your view about these different terms that different theoretical philosophers, I guess, use to talk about consciousness. So pantheism, panpsychism, panentheism, and then ultimately biocentricity, which we'd like to talk a little bit more about. So tell us maybe the differences between these and which one that you sort of subscribe to personally.
Okay, so I'm a panentheist, not a pantheist. Although I've been struggling to understand pantheism, to tell you the truth. That is the view that the universe and God are the same thing, that there is nothing beyond the physical universe. You know, it raises a bunch of questions, and I've asked these questions to very accomplished thinkers in pantheism, and I don't yet understand it, to tell you the truth. Just to be honest. I don't understand what it means to be God. You know, I look at the universe, and I personally see a lot of design in it, especially on planet Earth. But if you look at the universe, and it's dust and gas and 99.99999% uninhabitable space. What is godly about that? You know, I know that Spinoza and others had the same kind of deep reverence for the universe, which I appreciate, and I often feel when coming across their work, like I sort of like get what they're going for. But it almost seems like a cop-out somehow. Like it's a way of not having to do anything really, and just having this sort of detached appreciation, which Einstein had and others. It's that said, again, going back to Bernardo Kastrup, he has said an interesting thing on video. He's also an Iberian Dutchman, like Spinoza, and he claims that Spinoza has been totally misunderstood, and really reinterprets his understanding of what pantheism, what he was getting at. And so it's been on my bucket list to sort of like try to continue to unpack this and make sense of it. I don't think I think the universe had a beginning, and as such, there was something that brought the universe into existence. So therefore, I don't think that the universe is all there is, as the pantheists do, but rather there's something that transcends it. Now, and sorry to keep talking about this, and cut me off if you want, but unless the pantheists mean that the deeper you go down into reality, like when you break down the electrons and you see that there's quarks, and we don't really know what quarks are, but it's some kind of energy, and maybe there's something underlying that. Do I believe that you can get, I think that you become more, quote unquote, spiritual the deeper you get into physical reality, the less it seems to seem like actual matter. And therefore, maybe they mean that you access the metaphysical world through the physical world, and maybe that they mean that's the same thing. If that's what pantheism means, I'm getting better with it, you know. But again, they didn't know that hundreds of years ago, and I don't know what they mean. So that's so much for pantheism. In terms of panpsychism, Kabbalah does believe that all objects that exist in the physical universe have some level of consciousness, so I can agree with that. So nonetheless, I think that panpsychism is used often to take away the hard problem of consciousness as it's known, and to take God out of the picture. Because if everything inherently has consciousness, then we don't need some over consciousness, directing things and providing consciousness to the universe, because it's already fundamentally there. To me, that opens a whole can of worms. Why are things that way? How did it get that way? What does it mean that it's fundamentally conscious? If you're interested, I had a whole conversation with Dr. Philip Goff about this, who is an expert in panpsychism. So I view it ultimately as a step in the right direction, certainly better than materialism, but still strikes me as falling short of ultimate reality, maybe. What else did you ask me about? Oh, biocentrism, I actually have the book upstairs, and I have never cracked it, so I can't really speak cogently about it.
Let's transition a little bit to something that no conversation with a rabbi would be complete without, and that's a discussion of morality. I love the recent blog post on your site, Morality of Horrible Choices. So let's try to sort of look at the two extreme poles of morality as I see them, and the idea of moral relativism versus moral absolutism. And in a recent podcast interview with the nihilist James Tartaglia, you quoted a philosopher, and I think you're not sure who it was, who said something like, "I find it hard to accept that the only thing that's wrong with sticking a needle in a baby's eye is that I don't like it," which would be a very relativistic, right? A very moral relativistic kind of perspective. And I really loved your point by that quote, because there's a fundamental problem, right? I think all of us agree with that. It's not just wrong relatively, it's wrong in some sort of absolute sense. So can you give us your perspective on this, and what thoughts does it raise for you as a rabbi and as a philosopher?
I think it's binary. I either think we can hold that there is such a thing as morality, in which case it must be an absolute thing, because otherwise there is no standard by which to measure it against, or there's not, and if there's not, we just have to be honest about what it means is that there is no such thing as morality. And therefore, everything that people claim to be moral or immoral are simple cultural preferences or individual preferences, but they have no actual import. And so to do the generally accepted heinous act of, I see you have a baby behind you on your screen, it's incomprehensible to do something to harm a baby to most people. But nonetheless, if you hold that material reality is the only reality, there is nothing in material reality that tells us anything about what is right or wrong. And therefore, it is a story that is made up essentially by people that cannot be proven either way. And one of the unfortunate corollaries is there is no difference between the views of a Gandhi or a Hitler. These are just, in fact, it's not even that the views don't even mean anything, because views are simple electrochemical impulses in a brain, which has no meaning in any event. And all we have is sort of like a storm of interacting particles across the universe that have no meaning. And I know that there's often pushback against that because it's very uncomfortable. But I think I would prefer an honest sort of yes, unfortunately, this is the reality, or not even unfortunately, it's just like, yes, this is the reality. and deal with it,
Which is what Richard Dawkins would say, right? He would absolutely look you right in the eye, I think, and say that.
but then he would moralize about many, many things.
Maybe.
No, he does. I
Yep.
mean, and so I think what he would say is, yes, you're right. Ultimately, there is no such thing as immorality. However, in the situation we find ourselves in, we
People
have to
should
conduct
behave
things.
right.
Yeah. Well, and then I would say, what do you mean should? What does
Right.
should mean? Like, so it becomes a very slippery slope. And I find that almost nobody is willing to really live on that level. Everybody seems to want there to be a morality. But nonetheless, so the Jewish take, is absolutely that the entire purpose of existence is based in morality. The Torah is a litany of possible moral choices, giving you advice of which road to take in any given circumstance. So it is a morality guidebook at the end of the day. And if there is no such thing as morality, then it's a meaningless book, as all books are meaningless. So, it's a funny kind of conversation, but an important one. But at least I just think people should at least wrestle with it a little bit, that is not a simple matter. And the consequences of how you conclude are pretty huge. And I'll just give you one other example, which is, it's a little, people have told me this is an extreme example, but, there's a fascinating interview with Jeffrey Dahmer you can find on YouTube. He's a serial killer.
Mm-hmm.
And they're asking him, like, basically, why do you kill and eat your neighbors? And he says, well, I figure if we all just crawled out of the slime like millions of years ago, why should we try to regulate our behavior? And then I said, you know what, he's absolutely right. Like,
right.
You might have to deal with the consequences. He was arrested, and but does it matter? No, maybe if that pleases you to eat your neighbors, then who's to say that that's different than, having a nice meal at some restaurant? It's just a preference. So anyway, that's just some food for thought.
It's it's really interesting to me because, we are humans, Homo sapiens are developed to have an intellect, to have a intellect and ego that can actually say I and mine and you and the other. And so built into our very structure is a sense of a higher intelligence, a higher sort of knowledge or intellect that can determine what's seemingly right or wrong. So I find it interesting because, we're a creation of a higher evolution, and yet there's a question of morality, which I find to be fascinating.
Me too.
Yeah. So let's just, continue with a little bit of more hot sauce.
Okay.
All right. Recently, Robert Sapolsky maintained in a lot of press that the world is deterministic and that there's no free will. And of course, it was a fascinating reaction to this. And he maintains that we're nothing more or less than the biological and environmental luck of genetic luck and environmental luck for which we were raised and born into, and that we have no control. And therefore, there should not be, what's the word? We shouldn't be held to our actions or put in jail or arrested or anything, because we really actually have no control. It's a biological reaction or expression of who we are. And I wondered what you thought about that.
Well, on the one hand, he's being consistent. If you, on the other hand, I'm inclined to disbelieve him that he really wants that. I have a feeling that the first person who comes and punches him in the face on the street, that he'll be like, well, I don't want any consequences for this man, because he can't help himself, and and nobody can help themselves, and therefore let's abolish all the jails. And like, really, does that's what he wants? Okay. Like, and if furthermore, if he thinks that that's all true, he had no choice but to write this book, no choice but to lecture about it. So he admits that he's a puppet on an absolute level. First, and that even the truth that he's advocating is meaningless because no one is choosing to do anything positive or negative. Why is he sharing this information? What difference does it make anyway? I just find it odd, again, that the people who advocate these positions don't seem to really live in accordance with what they believe. Now, maybe we could say he's got no choice. I have to write this book. I have to, say these words, and you have to listen because that's your destiny. Okay, I would just say good luck to you, and hope you have a satisfying, determined life, with no control over it whatsoever. And best of luck.
Well, so whether we have a deterministic universe or a completely super deterministic universe or a universe with free will, I guess in many of those instances, we can have God or not God, right? So we can have a fully super deterministic universe would be, I guess, a deist God, whereas a theist God is in a universe with free choices. So let's talk about God. So
Okay.
I attended an event in which you interviewed the great physicist Brian Greene, which you called Science, God, and a Human Quest for Reality. And it was a wonderful event. And at the end of the interview, you gave Brian the stage and you asked him, God or no God? And he waxed very eloquent on the no God scenario. And you were very respectful, and you gave him the stage, and you didn't even take the last word. So if you could have the last word now, what do you say? God or no God, and why?
Well, I would go back to my first words in that conversation that I had with him, which, if I listen, far be it from me to criticize a very articulate, accomplished, and intelligent man. I don't necessarily think he's answered my questions satisfactorily in the course of the conversation. We talked about the fine-tuning of the constants of nature. He doesn't have an explanation for it. If it is universally regarded as extremely odd and extremely improbable, his explanation is to reach for the multiverse theory, which he admits is unprovable and maybe not even part of science. Therefore, more like a philosophical or even a theological position to believe in a multiverse. And I even followed up in our conversation and asked him, well, wait a second, what if there is no multiverse? Then what? And then it gets even more complicated, because even if there is a multiverse, how do we account for its existence? And its contradictions, and I think that he wasn't giving enough credit to some of the lines of questioning, and I understand that he's very, very confident in his position. He's definitely thought about it, and he's written books about it, and he's concluded what he's concluded. Nonetheless, I think that question, which if you ask Philip Goff, he really struggled with it, for instance, and then he came on to panpsychism as a result of having to deal with the fine-tuning problem. Like he believes that the universe seems designed, well, how do we account for that? You have to, okay. So the multiverse answer seems very weak to me personally. It just seems like it kicks the can down the road and creates other problems. But besides that, I quoted him from several prominent physicists, who have determined that there's no space really, there's no time really, that material reality at its core is not really there, and doesn't that sound an awful lot like what we think of as spiritual? And he didn't seem to feel that, but I can't help but look at the words of many very prominent, famous physicists, like who their words seem like theology to me, almost like they're describing a reality that is very similar to a metaphysical reality as understood by some of the world's great religions. But because they came to it from numbers and research and a different background, they don't see it overlapping with religion in any way. There's just non-overlapping magisteria, as one prominent paleontologist called it. So did I answer your question, or did I just sort of talk?
Nope, absolutely. It was great. It was great.
Okay.
Yeah, it's almost like before the wave function collapses and creates something that we call reality. There's multi options, there's multi perspective, it could go in a thousand ways, and it's very much a conversation of science. And so it's our language is changing in real time as it relates to all of this. And so in every episode, we ask our guests about what the ego might be as it relates to these kind of questions and conversations. We'd love to ask you, from a perspective as a rabbi and as a philosopher, if you have a view on the ego, what it might be, what it means to you, and what you might say to our listeners about how it expresses itself in our lives.
I appreciate that question. And I would say that the ego is the perceived separation from the all. It is ultimately a false separation, and one that unfortunately has many negative consequences for us as individuals. Every single spiritual tradition works on the reduction of ego. And that's with very good reason. It's because it is that warped perspective that the ego provides that I would say quite literally prevents us from seeing reality as it ultimately is, maybe. And therefore, like the ego reduction program that exists in Judaism, for instance, if you want me to speak from a rabbinical perspective, humility is considered the greatest of all traits, and the root of all positive traits. And therefore, anything that can be done to promote humility promotes spirituality, and promotes vision into reality. It's not by coincidence that Moses is called the greatest of all prophets, and simultaneously is called the humblest man who ever lived. Those things go hand in hand. So it's only through the means of getting the ego out of our way that we could possibly have a chance of perceiving things from a higher vantage point. And that really is, I said before that the Torah is a guidebook for morality. That's true, but it's simultaneously a guidebook for the reduction of ego, which compromises morality, because if you think about it, the ego is the thing that generates anger, it generates jealousy, it generates all kinds of warped perspectives that hurt both us and those around us. And it's this like negative cycle where the more you engage in it, the more caught by it you are. Like the Eddie in the Bernardo Castro example, you become more and more convinced of yourself, your individuality. And so for across cultures for thousands of years, people have recognized this. The ego it's a necessary force. It's good for us to struggle against it. It's good for us to elevate by overcoming it. It's better that we have it and overcome it than we don't have it at all. And that affords us the possibility of like earning our own station in this reality. And that is a very Jewish way of looking at things, is that God and humanity are in partnership in the perfection of reality. And the struggle is ultimately for the best, even if it's very uncomfortable. But yeah, that's how I see it.
That's beautiful. I love that, Adam. I think that's really beautiful. So before we let you go, I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell our listeners a little bit about the Feed Your Head podcast and what they should look forward to maybe in some coming episodes or just the rest of the year broadly. And make sure to include your thoughts on the Secret Chord podcast, which I think is an absolute little gem that anybody who likes music should check out. And finally, maybe include any ways that our listeners can learn more about the Jewish community and how they can learn about Judaism and potentially work with you.
Yes, the Feed Your Head ultimately is a platform that starts with the assumption that an over dedication to materialism is I don't want to use too strong of a word, but I wanted to say stultifying to humanity, and actually prevents scientific advancements and philosophical advancement, and I think has led to the proliferation of anxiety and depression that we see in our culture. As Lisa Miller, who I was privileged to speak to with you guys in presence, says that psychology simply functions better when it's fueled by spirituality. And she has evidence to support that, and scientific evidence, not just personal. So therefore, we create and provide vehicles for people to engage in this notion of philosophical, theological, scientific, and arts-based ways of sort of looking at the world and mining it for what I believe is its transcendent essence. and we do it in such a way that we only use highly credible thinkers, credentialed, trained people who I believe give a kind of credibility and ultimately a permission to take these things more seriously, or to re-engage with them, or to engage for the first time. That's what the platform is ultimately about. And we do monthly interviews. We have articles 3 times a week. You can find us on Substack, Instagram, YouTube. It's a growing population of people who are engaging with it, thankfully. And I also have an audio podcast called The Secret Chord, which does the same thing, but just from an arts perspective. We do this with poetry sometimes also, but I'm more drawn to music. As we spoke about earlier, I believe that music is actually a transcendental activity. The people just simply don't realize that it is, and therefore I select an artist or a thematic group of songs, and try to pull out from the lyrics and even some of the music itself some of the, I call it, hidden beauty and meaning. So that's what that is. And yes, the best way of getting in touch with your Jewish roots, if you're interested in that, is through a website that I also am highly engaged with, which is called aish.com, AISH.com, cutting edge platform that reaches millions and millions of people per month, and is also a very dynamic and important website. So, and much bigger than mine. So check that out.
Well, thank you very, very much for your time, Adam. The work you're doing is magnificent and important and really, really insightful. So thanks for your time today.
My great pleasure, and I look forward to your great success with this endeavor, and I look forward to hearing it when I can.
This episode was brought to life by Ka Pathogenics, offering 100% plant-based supplements featuring Kana, a South African plant that's clinically proven to reduce stress, lift mood, and improve focus, helping you feel more alive, energized, and connected while also supporting your immune and nervous systems. Kana is safe, legal, non-addictive, and life-changing. Try Kakana Chews or Tincture to feel calm and alive from head to heart. Go to ohmyka.com and get 10% off with code REALITYMAYBE at checkout. That's ohmyka.com.
Exploring Reality Maybe is written, produced, fact-checked, and edited by Jody R. Weiss and David Schwartz. Research support is provided by Semicolon Connects. Music produced by Nextbox. Visit our website at exploringrealitymaybe.org to find show notes, transcripts, bios, and to learn more. If you like the show, please visit our website to donate.